that's what negotiators or litigators are working with. They want to get the best deal for their client, whereas when a mediator or collaborative attorney is trying to get the best deal for the family and is really thinking more holistically about everybody in the family.
Hi, I'm Rachel Green, Brooklyn-based divorce mediator and collaborative attorney, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Join me as I chat with other industry professionals about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind, where we talk about families who are in transition, separating, divorcing, and figuring out how to keep their kids in mind through the process. I'm very happy to have Joy Rosenthal as my guest. Joy is a dear friend, as well as a very experienced mediator and collaborative attorney. And Joy has done so many interesting things that I hope she'll share with us. Before you came to mediation, I know you represented children, and so you have some insights into how the courts function and what they do to protect children. And you are also working now teaching family law at CUNY Law School, so you're up to date on all the cutting edge developments in the field. And you have a very informative newsletter that you send out that I often read, and at times it has brought me to tears because you're so tuned into the effect that our work has on families, and you have a big heart and it comes through in all your work. So welcome. So happy to have a chance to talk to you.
Well, so thank you. Thank you.
Just to
Not
start,
only today, thank you for like 15 years of generosity and mentoring me and being helpful and just being a kind person and thoughtful person who does this work.
Well, I'm happy to have the chance to help you. So Joy, just to start, why don't you share with us, what is it about this work that calls to you? Why do you want to work with families who are struggling?
I didn't want to go to law school. I was working at NYU, and I used to have to walk past NYU Law School every day on my way to work. And I would say, who would ever want to do that? Like, that has got to be the most boring thing, because I just thought it was all contracts. Of course, all we're doing now is divorce agreements, which are really contracts. But I was working with teenagers who were involved. I was doing literacy work with teenagers, teaching kids in special ed how to read as part of a program through NYU, actually. And then I realized that the teenagers all had legal issues. They were involved with the court system because they had gotten in trouble, or because they were in foster care, or their siblings were in foster care and they were trying to get custody of them. There were all kinds of complicated things. This was in the early 90s. And that was really what inspired me to go to law school, because I wanted to help them. And I thought maybe I could help them more as a lawyer. So I kind of knew from the beginning that that's what I wanted to do, was to work with families and kids. I got out of law school and I worked for legal aid for the better part of 10 years, representing kids in foster care. And then I did some delinquency work, which is criminal cases for kids.
So you were in like the civil division of legal aid?
It's called the Juvenile Rights Project now. It was
called
Juvenile Rights at the time. So it's only working with kids. So yes, I've done litigation, a lot of litigation. We were in court 10 times a day, and represented hundreds of kids at a time. It was a little chaotic. But I've never represented parents in divorce cases. I've never done divorce litigation. So when I switched over, I got interested in mediation, and I realized that divorce mediation and collaborative law would be a possibility. And I was very excited about that. I kind of realized that I needed to learn divorce law, but that would be much easier than the divorce attorneys who needed to learn how to be neutral.
Interesting.
Or had to learn how to take off their litigator hat and put on their mediator neutral hat and see the other side hat. Whereas I'd really been doing it all along, because when you represent kids, kids are really loyal to both parents, and they really
Right.
want everybody to get along. They want peace more than anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I
I
mean,
feel
sometimes people say to me, how can you be neutral? And that's exactly what I say to them. I say, I try to look at it the way that your kids look at it, because kids can hold, they can like hold two realities in their head at the same time. Like at dad's house, we never answer the phone during dinner. At mom's house, we answer the phone if it rings during dinner.
right. And right, they just accept the fact that there's different rules. I mean, we all live with different rules, right? There's different rules when we're at the beach than there are when we're at, a party, or there's different rules when we're crossing the street than there are when we're playing ball, or different rules at school versus different rules at home. Like, it's really not as foreign as it seems. But I think that's a really good way of putting it, that sometimes I say to people when I'm mediating, what actually happened? Like, they'll be arguing about, you said this, no, I didn't, yes, you did, and I'm like, okay, this is a strange kind of situation where the truth doesn't really matter to me. What really, really matters to me is how you experienced it and how you experienced it. And you could have experienced that as a slight, and you could have meant it as just a neutral fact or something like that, and and that happens all the time, right, with
It
communication.
does. Right. Right. Yeah. Like the intent, it doesn't always match up with how it's heard. And
Yeah,
and when we hear something and it impacts us, we feel like, well, they must have intended to hurt me. They were trying to get me angry. They were trying to get me upset, instead of thinking maybe they were just making an offhand comment and they didn't realize that it was going to hurt me.
right, or right, maybe, right. But the other thing, as you know, in mediation, we're really focused on the future rather than what happened in the past. So,
Right.
here we have a situation. I mean, I always say there's a reason you're getting divorced. I understand that, but I don't need to delve into very much about what that reason is. I'm more interested in, what are we going to do going forward?
Yeah.
How are we going to keep it so that when you're dropping the kids off at your ex's house, the kids aren't going to be hearing a whole lot of arguing?
Right. Well, that they should handle like a pizza delivery. Hello, here's your delivery. How are you? Good. Have a nice night.
Right. Do they smell good?
Right.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
I think that's a very loaded moment for kids when they like, if the parents do have a parent to parent drop off. I mean, so many families that we work with have the drop off at school and pick up at school, so the parents don't have to see each other. And then when the
Right,
parents are together, the kids are like looking like, what are they, what are they doing? How are they feeling? What are they thinking? You
right,
know, it's so
right.
loaded. So, Joy, when someone calls your office or meets you for initial consultation, what do you tell them about the different options?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, I sort of think that there's a continuum, right? And let's say from going to Starbucks and figuring it all out, to mediation, to collaborative, to hiring lawyers to negotiate for you. And they get increasingly more expensive and increasingly less involved for the parties, I would say. Maybe less involved isn't the right word, but if you have your lawyer speaking for you, you don't have to be face to face with your ex. So, I mean, mediation is one of the few things, and I'm speaking to the choir here, I know, where it's cheaper and better if you can do it, but it's not for everybody, right? So I really ask clients to kind of think about whether mediation would work for them. So first of all, you have to have the other person's agreement to mediate.
They both have to agree.
They both have to agree. It's voluntary.
Right.
Second of all, the way I do it, not the way all mediators do it, but the way I mediate, everybody's in the room together for everything. So
even though it could be a virtual room these days.
It's always a virtual room these days in my practice. Yes. But I meet with both parties together. So that can have its difficulties sometimes for people. And I'll tell them, look, you don't have to agree on the things that we're going to be working out, but you do have to both agree to mediate, and you have to be there in good faith, and you have to be honest about your finances and trust that the other person's being honest about their finances.
And I always say they also have to be willing to listen to each other, even if they don't agree.
Right. So that's something that I think part of our job is to help them listen to each other, because that's not always
true.
easy. When you're in conflict with somebody, it's often hard to listen.
Yeah.
And I explained to them, look, I'm not going to be the one making decisions for you. You're going to be the ones making decisions. You're in the driver's seat, and my job is really guide you through the conversation and to guide you through the whole process as a mediator. And then I explain a little bit about collaborative, and I say that with collaborative, you each have your attorneys in the room, and the attorneys are there to provide you support and to be there and advocacy. But the attorneys are also trained as mediators and are there to help you come to an agreement. And I explained that the difference between those processes, collaborative and mediation on one hand, and litigation on the other, is that we're all trained in law school to be zealous advocates for our clients. I think there's a different word for it now, but that's how I was trained. And that's what negotiators or litigators are working with. They want to get the best deal for their client. Whereas for when a mediator or collaborative attorney is trying to get the best deal for the family and is really thinking more holistically about everybody in the family. So we're talking
thinking kind of more holistically, like big picture. Like I had a client who said, how I feel in 5 weeks is different than how I'll feel in 5 months or in 5 years. And my hope with my clients is that they aren't going to look back and wince when they think of how they behaved during their divorce in 5 years, So trying to take the longer view. And I mean, the other thing is that with families, the behavior of the parents now is going to impact the children their whole lives. I mean, I've had people come in for prenups because of, how their mom screwed over their dad or vice versa in the divorce. And this was the landscape they grew up on, was feeling like there was this, completely unequal power that played out throughout their childhoods. And they can't get married without making sure that won't happen to them in the event that they get divorced. So this stuff just, it lasts forever. It just percolates down through families. Yeah. And I mean, that's why I don't really understand the litigation model where, I mean, litigation is like ritualized war, and your goal is to destroy the other person. And, your kids will never thank you for destroying their other parent.
Yeah, I just had a mediation that fell apart, and the wife got a lawyer without telling the husband. There was no discussion about it in mediation. She just left, and that was very hard. It's painful, I think it's painful for everybody, but like I said, mediation isn't for everybody. So, and it's a voluntary process, so there's not really much you can do. If your spouse insists on going to lawyers, then there's nothing, then you kind of have to. And the other piece of that I find just incredible is how expensive litigation is.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
that's why I asked that question. Whose kids do you want to put through college? Yours or mine? Yours or your lawyers, not mine. But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, it really can be the cost of a college education, or at
Yeah.
least a couple of years of it. I don't know. College is so expensive
Yeah.
now too. But
No, I know people who've spent, I mean, I know somebody who spent $140,000 on their divorce. And then I've heard of people who spent even more. I mean, it's
oh
just
yeah,
astronomical. And
we we had a litigator come to speak to our class this year, and he said he sees people spend between $50,000 and $100,000 sometimes on their divorce. Now I'm assuming
typical.
those are really rich people, but even so, it's horrible.
Well, I have a friend who's going through a divorce and I'm trying to help her a little bit. And she's not a lawyer. And she believes, I don't know if this is true or not, but their kid is grown and they actually separated like 15 years ago. But they just never did anything to, finalize any terms. But now the father wants to remarry, and so he has to get divorced. So uh, they she the one issue is the buyout of the house, and the mother has been living in the house all these years and renovated it and paid the mortgage, and so she wants some credit in buying out the father from the house. She wants some credit for everything that she spent. And my friend has come to think that the two lawyers, have wanted to end up with a result where she would have to sell the house, where she wouldn't be able to buy it out because she thinks that they are worried about their own fees. How are they going to get paid unless the house is sold? So there's cash.
There's such a
And
conflict of interest.
it's such a conflict of interest. And I think she might be right, honestly, because um, some things have been botched, it sounds like, so that she wasn't even allowed to present her all the, she has like sheets and sheets of Excel spreadsheets with all the expenses that she paid for. And she hasn't been able to present it to the judge. And I can't
Well,
quite understand why, because she doesn't really understand why, and I haven't litigated, so
right.
anyway.
Yeah, I don't really, that's why I bring somebody in when I'm teaching. That's why I bring somebody in to talk about divorce litigation, because it's not anything that I have experience with either. It's different from New York has two different systems. So they're for people who are unmarried, their cases go to family court, and that's where I worked. For divorces, those are handled in Supreme Court, which is our trial court. Um, and so I've never really done litigation in Supreme Court. So it's different. There's like a whole different procedure and a whole different timeline and that kind of thing. And the discovery process in divorce cases is can be very extensive, and that's where this should be coming out. But it's not something that you and I really deal with, right? I mean, we ask people to fill out a list of their assets and what they own and what they owe. And like I said, you sign an agreement to mediate that says, I'm going to be honest about my finances, and I'm trust that my spouse is going to be honest about their finances, and that's about the extent of it. I was listening to one of your prior podcasts where you had a forensic CPA, and he was talking about finding millions of dollars that were from a husband who wasn't disclosing. Like, that might happen. We don't know. And I certainly have mediated cases where I think that somebody's engaging in mediation in order to not have to sign that sworn statement of net worth. But that's not the norm
It's
for
not
us,
typical.
right?
And the other thing is that I think that they know whether they can trust their spouse or not. I mean, I had a case years ago where there was a guy who ran some outdoor flea markets in New York City, and the wife said they're always, throughout their marriage, there was this freezer in the basement full of cash. And she went down to the basement the other day and she opened the freezer and it was empty. So,
That's a
I
perfect
said,
story. Such a New York story.
it's such a New York story, right? I said, well, she knows about the freezer full of cash. She knows that it is now empty. I
Right.
mean, she
I
said,
want to know if it was ones or hundreds in there.
probably both. She said, she actually said in mediation right to her husband, she said, I know you, you're a fighter. You will keep me fighting about this for 3 years. You're probably giving me several $100,000 less than I would get if I kept fighting and digging. And you know what? It's worth it to me to get divorced right now and start my new life with my new boyfriend and have $300,000 less.
Right. Well, and that's another thing about mediation is that money isn't everything. And sometimes I tell people just walk away. You're going to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars fighting over this old 20-year-old beat up Volvo. And it's just like, give him the Volvo. And,
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just a silly example, but you understand what I'm saying. Like sometimes it's like, what's the value of your peace of mind? What's the value of getting this over with so that you can start over? What's the value
Well,
of not having them involved in your life?
that's what I've never really understood about litigation, because when I'm in a conflict with somebody, it kind of just eats away in my brain. I feel like I walk down the street and I'm thinking about the conflict. I'm thinking, I'm arguing with them in my head. I'm I like a conflict just it engrosses me and it sucks me into it, and it sucks up my life. And I've always felt like the cost of maintaining that conflict is not worth the price, like, of whatever is at stake.
Right. Well, I think that's why, the statistics for lawyers in terms of like alcoholism, it's not great. But I also think that I've learned a lot from one of my mentors, probably yours too, Gary Friedman, about meditating, and Norman Fisher and Jack Himmelstein about meditating, which I've been doing for the last few years. And now I do yoga every morning. Like I think we have to actually seek out ways to take care of ourselves in ways that other people who are not doing conflict resolution might not. When I was working at Legal Aid, I was very, very specific about there were certain TV shows I wouldn't watch. There were certain movies I wouldn't watch. I couldn't stand any. I absolutely wouldn't and still don't go to horror movies. I would walk out of movies if there was too much violence. It was too. It. I just had to, as I said, take care of myself in ways that other. I think if you're doing something, another line of work, you don't have to. So
Yeah, and those are good tools for our clients as well as
yeah, and that's
yeah.
something I teach the law students. Because CUNY Law School is all geared toward public interest law. So almost everybody, not all my students are going to be family law attorneys. A lot of them will, but some of them are going to go into immigration. Some of them are going to go into criminal defense. Some of them are going to represent parents whose kids have been taken away from them. There's all kinds of things that they're going to do. But the distinguishing feature of CUNY is that it's not corporate law. They're almost everybody. The training is all in working directly with families and providing direct services. And so it's high burnout work. So I talk to the students about how to take care of yourself, and maybe I should do more as I'm thinking about it, but and how to kind of pace yourself. And I asked them this semester, I give them homework every week, and they either can do an assignment or they can do a reflection memo about how are they feeling about things, because I want them to be able to process what they're going through. And some of the stuff that we talk about is very difficult. And one of the ways I process what is by sending out that newsletter every week. that talks about their cases that I've had or cases that are in the news. Not so much cases I've had, but or at least not recently, or things that are going on in my life that have to do with conflict resolution, that have to do with, I try to keep it professional, but or at least to draw it back. And I mean, there are so many different aspects of this work, but I think it is really important to take care of ourselves and to find the positive in whatever's going on.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are screaming at each other, and I'm like, okay, well, at least you both like agree that this is a time to scream at each other or something. Like I'll try to make a joke about it, but like try to like get them to like stop screaming for a second just to listen, take a step back.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of why they're screaming is because they're not feeling heard by each other. So it's kind of, you have to kind of slow it down at that point.
Right.
Yeah, I worked with a couple who, like, one of the things that I generally raise as something that they might want to discuss is what are they going to tell the children about, like, what story of the divorce will they tell the children? And then, there are people who say, well, I want to be honest with my child, and I'm going to say that that their, other parent cheated on me, went outside the marriage and found somebody. And you kind of like, you don't want to tell your 8-year-old that their other parent, you're going through you're going through your own hurt. And I hear that, I understand that, and you're entitled to your own feelings, but your kid is not experiencing it the same way you are. And yet, some parents are fighting actively in the home, and the children are there and they hear everything.
Right. Well, that's one of the things, sometimes people say they stay together for the sake of the kids, but it's really better for them to be apart. And, I found, and I'm sure you have too, that kids mostly want peace.
Yeah.
And so that's really, yeah, that's tough. That's really tough.
Yeah. And then I had a couple come in the other day who said their 13-year-old figured out that dad had a girlfriend before dad told mom. So 13-year-old told mom. And I was like,
that can be tough. Well, it's interesting that they still stayed mediation. I hope they can work it out. That's very hard.
Yeah,
And there's some issues.
yeah.
I mean, one of the things I tell people is that when they're going through a divorce, they're really reorganizing their family, and they have to kind of re-establish their boundaries with each other. As you know, I lost my husband, my first husband, about in 2001, so almost 22 years ago. And he and I were so close that I felt like the process of grieving and the process of forming my life and moving from being a married woman to a single woman was like taking Velcro and undoing each little tiny thing one by one. And I feel like that's true for a divorce too. Like there's so many little things, like, is your toothbrush on the right or in the middle? I mean, or do you sleep on the right or the middle? Like you have to figure out like all of these different things. And it's, in some ways it's similar. So I mean, part of what I'm talking about is the grief of divorce, but part of what I'm talking about is like there are so many things to figure out, and it can be overwhelming. And when you get a time bomb like that, like having your kid tell your tell you that about what your husband is doing, like, of course, that's devastating. And it's going to take a long time to heal from that.
Yeah.
And all of your identity, your identity changes, your expectations of each other changes, your expectations of yourself changes, how much you trust them or what you trust them about changes. Like, there's so much to figure out.
And your whole
And it,
expectations of your future, like you thought your future looked like this, and you're finding out that it looks like this,
absolutely. Right,
And
right.
yeah, one of the things that I do love about this process is that the clients really have a lot of control over many aspects of mediation. Like they can go, when I hear circumstances like that, I want to say, okay, you're in shock and you need some time to just like slowly let this seep in and begin slowly to think about what your next steps are going to be. And you don't know ultimately where you're going to end up, and you don't know what the path is. We're going to figure out together what the path is to get from point A to point B. And you can decide, you want to meet once a month, you could meet once a week, you could meet every 3 months. You can, talking about financial disclosure that we were talking about before, you can bring statements into mediation and we'll all sit and look at them together. You could exchange them between yourselves. You could have a financial neutral, look at all the information and put a report together. You have so many options. And as far as children's schedules go, you could, try 3 schedules in 3 months, do each one for a month, and then come back and see how they felt. And for, everybody, you can have your kid involved in that discussion or not. There's so many aspects that they have control over, and that's not true in other processes.
Those are such great creative solutions. I love that. And do you
Thanks.
find that if people are coming to you and like they've just separated or they're still living together and they've just decided to get divorced, that's harder or easier than if they've been separated for a year or two?
Oh, in general, I find that it's much easier if they've been separated for a year or two. Like the people who, I've had a number of couples who've come to me and just worked out, okay, we're going to pay our kids' expenses this way. We're going to have this schedule for the kids. And then they disappear and they come back a year and a half later. So in other words, they work out just what they need to work out in order to separate. Sometimes they do a preliminary separation agreement and it just says those few things, because sometimes they want something in writing before they move out. But I find that like they've just like let the dust settle and the shock is over, and they're able to be, ready to start looking toward their future, envisioning where they want to be in 5 years, and what they need in order to get there. And there's some maybe forgiveness that's come up. Maybe they've had a chance to think, how did I contribute to this? Because in my opinion, it's never just one person's fault or right. Both of them contribute to even when one person has gone outside the marriage and it's a betrayal. There's a reason why they couldn't turn to their spouse to work on whatever it is that they needed to work on in the marriage. So, and for people who are so raw and it's so new, we just have to go much more slowly, to give them time to catch up.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that I found that also it's much easier when they've been separated. I think the emotions have come down, and really in a lot of ways, like I said earlier, this is what we're doing is working out the terms of a contract, and it's a business negotiation. And as awful as that sounds, because of course we're talking about families and we're talking about kids and dogs and but a lot of it is about money, and a lot of it really is a business negotiation. And both people have to kind of be wearing that business hat. And one of the things I say is that I'm trying, I'm like trying to get people to a point where they can think about their spouse like a coworker. Like you're civil, you don't talk about everything. You're working on a project together. Maybe your project now is going to be raising the kids together, but there are certain times you have to work together. Um, and you're kind to each other, but you're not in each other's business. And that can be really hard if they've just separated because they were in each
Yeah.
other's business. And so it's sort of helping them get through the transition. And another thing I like about mediation, you must find this too, is that if you work with somebody over a period of time, and sometimes it can be quite a long time, you see how they're healing, you see how they're progressing through the divorce process. And that's nice. I mean, I love the episode that you did with somebody who was your a former client, because then you get to see years later how, because we don't usually get to see that, right?
Right.
How it affected them. So that's really nice. I have a few clients who stay in touch, and it's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah. So Joy, what was it that led you to want to teach?
My parents both work in universities. It was kind of, my brother is a professor. My other brother was a professor. Um, that's always kind of been in my blood. When I was working at Legal Aid, I always had students working for me, doing their internships or doing their. I had students from Columbia Law School working with me, and then I taught at NYU Law School for a year. I I want to. There's a couple things about it. One is I like the idea. I'm passionate about CUNY Law School. I found that it was an incredible experience for me, and I love the students that are coming out of there because of its mission. But I'm also I like breaking things down, and so I started teaching a few years ago, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's great fun, and it's good because it like helps you brush up on like what all the things that we need to know, um, and it's really interesting to get the students' perspectives on things, and it's helpful for me to see like, well, there's like legal logic, and then there's real life logic, and they're different,
Yes,
and so
yes, that's true.
help you remember that. Like they're like, what? Are you sure what you just like? That don't make no sense. And I'm like, I know that don't make no sense, but
Right, right.
always.
In my
And
federal tax class in law school, I raised my hand once and said, that makes no sense. And the teacher stopped the class and he said, sense, sense. We're talking about law, not sense. And I felt so embarrassed. I felt like I would remember that for the rest of my life. You have to learn what are the rules? How are they applied? You don't have to think about sense.
that's funny. But yeah, that's true, right? There's that it's really true. So the students keep me on my toes, and I love that. And then I was teaching, we were happily going along, and then COVID happened in the middle of the semester, and we had to go online. And CUNY was great about giving classes to the professors about how to teach online.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
so, yeah, it was terrific. And then I got interested, and I was like, well, I'm doing all this work teaching this law students who are never going to use this stuff or aren't going to use this stuff for a long time. What about teaching the same stuff to the people who are going through divorce? So I designed an online course called Landing on Your Feet, A Compassionate Lawyer's Guide to Divorce, for people who are going through divorce. So it's like an 8-week online course that people can look at the videos or listen to the podcast whenever they want. And it goes through the process options like mediation, collaborative negotiation, that kind of thing. how to set yourself up, like how to fill out the financial worksheets and how to create a parenting plan. I guess that's more later. But then, and then the 4 aspects that you really need to know, right? Alimony, property division, child support, and the parenting plan. And then there's a module that I'm creating now on negotiation. And I've run it a couple of times, and I found that the students, they got a lot out of the content, the materials, but they also got a lot out of learning from each other and having time to ask questions. So I have a question and answer time that goes along with it too, and there's other ways to get support from me.
Oh, that's
while
great.
they're
So we
doing it.
definitely should make sure that we have a link to what is landing on your feet, a compassionate lawyer's guide to divorce, in the show notes below. I'll make sure that we have a link to that.
Okay, that would
That
be great.
sounds fantastic. Has it been well received?
It's been very well received. Well, so the model I was using before was we're going to like run it a few times a year and it's only going to be available at that time. And then I decided that when people are getting divorced, they need the information now.
Right, that's
So
true.
they don't want to wait for like 3 months or 6 months or whatever. And by that point, they've forgotten about it. And it's really designed for people who are either thinking about divorce and haven't quite decided yet, or are at the very beginning stages. And so it's a little tricky to catch them at that time.
Right.
So I decided to make it what they call evergreen, which means available all the time. And that's just opening up now. It's going to open up next week. I mean, people can enroll now, but by the time this airs, it'll be open.
Right.
So yeah, so
Well, that's fantastic.
notes and it's been, I think it's really helpful. I think it gives people a lot of confidence and helps them feel less overwhelmed because there's so much going on, and helps them feel less alone. That's the feedback that and then,
well, Joy, I think you're amazing. You have your own private practice as a mediator and as a collaborative lawyer, negotiating settlements as well, and you're teaching, and you created this landing guide for people who are starting the divorce process, and it's been a joy to talk to you, and thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you. It's so much fun to talk to you. This was great. All right,
Yeah.
we could talk for hours, I know.
Well, and I hope we will soon. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.